Welcome. Welcome very, very much to Conversations, where I'm pleased to welcome to the program Lawrence, or Larry Grossman. And Larry Grossman, for those who are in the audience would be aware, was longtime president of PBS and also was president at NBC, has a long experience in broadcast and telecommunications. And I'd like to show right at the outset he's written a book that I personally would like to say I think one and all ought to repair to for trying to understand the new emerging information technologies. And let's show it right at the outset. It's called The Electronic Republic, and it's subtitled, Larry?
It's called Reshaping Democracy in the Information Age.
There's hardly a subject that's more interesting and more relevant to the development of our society, and it's got a very glowing account by David McCullough at the back and so forth. And welcome very, very much to Conversations and to Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
Thanks, Harold. Glad to be here.
My pleasure. I was talking to you before we started talking, and you're talking about the implications of the electronic media, which is coming upon us just almost exponentially now. It's an incredible development in the modern experience that's characteristic of our time. But it's interesting because you began the book with a really very, very, very interesting chapter, if I may say so, on political developments, and even going back to Periclean or 5th century BC Greece, where they had participatory democracy. And it's interesting, you sort of began the book in that milieu. Huh?
Well, there's a funny thing happening on the way to the telecommunications revolution. And that is that in many ways the ground is shifting in our politics. We're seeing a major transformation in democracy. And a lot of it is going back to 2,500 years ago, where we had the direct democracy, which is the way democracy started, of ancient Greece, where the citizens themselves would be both the rulers and the ruled. That is, they would assemble some 40 times a year and make the decisions of government. And now we are doing electronically what they used to do in person, moving together and participating along with our elected representatives in the decision-making of government on a daily basis.
It might be interesting to spell that out, because, you know, there's not enough discussion, it seems to me, as we try and understand. There's all this talk about town hall meetings, and there's all kinds of talk that there has been in the political dialogue recently in our country, but we haven't talked enough about the unique quality of that situation. As you say, they would have had these, the citizens, it might be well to say there was probably a relatively few in terms of the overall population of Athens, maybe 10% or so, and it was based on a slave society and so forth, but that they would have these councils or meetings, and they would meet as often, as you say, as 40 times a year, and it was a direct participatory rather than a representative democracy. And that's kind of an interesting, unique thing that they tried, isn't it?
Yes. Well, see, democracy started, it's been very rare, and it started in ancient Greece with the idea, these were small city-states, that everybody could come together in the course of a day and make the decisions and govern themselves. As you say, there were only men who were eligible. They had to be native-born citizens. But no matter how rich or poor they were, those who were eligible were all participated. And then when the big nations arose, obviously you couldn't have direct democracy, so that a little over 200 years ago, for the first time, we had representative government, where we would elect people to represent us, and they would carry out the policies of governing, the Congress and the President, and if we didn't like what they did, we'd throw the rascals out. But now we are moving toward, and it's, the whole point of the book is the electronic republic is going to be a hybrid, a combination of representative government, where we continue to elect people to work for us, and at the same time the people have a direct say through polling, through ballot initiatives, through referenda, through call-in shows, through fax machines, so that at any given time the President and the Congress knows exactly what the people want and in what priority order they want it done. And
you spelled that out, opinion polls and the role of public opinion. We want to talk about these, but I don't want to quite get off this yet, because they said they would have issues, and there was a group of people whose responsibility it was, in a certain sense, back again to Periclean Greece, that would frame the issues or present the information to make sure that the citizens or those who were participating were well enough informed. That was an important part of the way they worked things out, too. They would have had a group of, I don't know what we would call them. I don't know if those would be our commentators of the modern era or what, but there was a group of people who had a special role. Are you familiar?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's a very important point. Yeah. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, recognized that they just couldn't let democracy happen by itself, that it really took hard work and an organized effort to be sure that the citizens were informed, that they were prepared to make decisions in an intelligent way, that they knew what the issues were going to be that were coming up.
They had to be educated.
And so they had two major things that we have not invoked yet, and maybe it's time we took a look at them. One is what they call a Council of 500.
Yeah, what was they?
And those were people who were ordinary citizens who had the responsibility of often sleeping and staying in the marketplace, had the responsibility of making sure that the citizens who were going to meet knew what the agenda was, knew what the issues were. They were there to respond to any questions about the facts and to generally let people know what it was that was going to be discussed.
Now, I wonder what their role, would that be the lobbyists of the modern executive?
Well, the lobbyists
had an official function, though.
They had an official function, but they were not supposed to make decisions themselves.
Right.
And they were not supposed to take positions on any of the issues. They were simply there as resources for the public to depend upon to get educated about the questions that were coming up.
Our librarians or our...
Well, it's sort of like the Library of Congress. You know, the Library of Congress has a legislative service that supplies information to the Congress and their staff.
That's right. That was the initial rationale for it being formed.
Because they're the ones that make the decisions. Well, now if the people themselves are becoming the fourth branch of government and participating in the decision-making, then we've got to start, maybe the Library of Congress, for example, should take on the job of making the kinds of passing out the information through CD-ROMs, through fax, through computerized efforts, to pass out the information about the major issues to the citizens.
That was an issue that was raised in your book, because we have the public library systems, and that's one place where we might be able to vouchsafe the public's ability to not be muscled out, as it were, by big money or other special interests in terms of information availability. But the libraries ought to be able to take on the role of being public places for the electronic media, which is coming. We used to think of them as being in the print realm, but the CD-ROMs and other kind of internet.
That's right. Well, a combination of satellites and of television and of telephone and of computers has made it possible to pour out all kinds of information and do it instantaneously, and it becomes two-way. That is, not only can the government communicate to the people, but the people now can communicate back to the government.
Yeah.
And we see that, for example, in the state of Oregon, which is taking on in the next Senate election, they're going to have people voting at home. And so you don't have to wait till Election Day any longer. That will be a mail ballot, but pretty soon they can do that electronically. I mean, if there's a shopping channel that can check out your credit card when you order, you certainly can organize a system of voting by electronics.
Yeah, Social Security got everybody pegged in a way. You could do that.
That's right.
Yeah.
The other major thing that the Greeks recognized was the need to have an active, participatory citizenry.
Right.
Pericles himself made the famous comment, that a citizen who does not participate is a bad citizen. That is to say, is not a citizen. The definition of citizen is somebody who is concerned about the general good, about public affairs. And so they had a very vigorous civic educational system for kids from the very youngest age.
Right.
And it became a very important matter to them to get people out to the meetings, to get people informed about the meetings, and to make sure that people were interested and engaged in the meetings.
Yeah, we
don't do much of that here.
No, I know, and we want to keep drawing these distinctions between now and then, and so it's good to bracket history and those kind of things. But because we talk now about the erosion of the civic space and so forth in our society, and the lack of interest, and the voting records are down and so drastically in our country and so forth now, and there's a lot of people who are sort of in a sense turned off to the public civic sphere. And there they did. And it's this participatory democracy. I wonder if there's a link between that participatory democracy such as they had and what we used to have the town hall meetings up in New England and so forth. And they had that kind of, we have had that tradition, and it rings true to the American sense, it seems to me, the American vision, it rings true, this idea of a participatory democracy, it just didn't seem practicable over the years. Or, you know, when you were separated by hundreds of miles and you had a horse to ride to get there.
And when the country got too big,
Yeah.
and the seat of government became very distant from where you were,
Yeah.
you could have a town hall meeting, and that's what town meetings were in small New England villages, where everybody could come together and make the decisions.
Everybody knew one another.
And everybody knew one another.
Yeah.
Now the whole notion of and the communities would control themselves. That was just kind of the idea of Jefferson's
Sure.
democracy.
Absolutely.
Well, now the whole idea, the nature of community is changing. The ground is shifting from under us as people are trying to recapture the government from the politicians, the professionals, and from the press as well.
And the vested interest.
And the vested interest.
Yeah.
And at the very time that people feel most frustrated with politics and politicians is the time when they are getting a greater opportunity than ever before, through electronics, to be sure, to participate in the daily decision-making.
Yeah.
And one of the big problems that's coming ahead in the electronic republic is that the community used to be geographically defined. You know, we vote where we live, we elect representatives to represent us in our counties or our states or our wards or our districts or our cities. And now with satellites, the communities are not restricted by geography.
That's
if you have a special interest in favor or against abortion or immigration or education or affirmative action or whatever is current, geography is no longer a limit to organizing those who agree with you and becoming politically active. You can sit in your den or your living room or your bedroom or your kitchen.
And it can be in Timbuktu or it can be in any place.
Through computers and through satellites, you can create a lot of political mischief and upheavals.
A lot of mischief, right. Yeah.
Without having to get out on the streets, you know, with your neighbors. And it can be done from one end of the country to the other. So that we're seeing the rise of issue-based politics.
That's very interesting. You brought that out,
with substitutes for geographically or sectional politics.
Yeah, and the breakdown of the old ward bosses and the ward systems and that patronage that used to be in there, that's breaking down. The political parties are not the power that they were or the coalescing force that they were and so on.
And
things are changing very, very rapidly.
And what the electronic media, what television and radio and call-in shows and now computers and cable are doing is they're wiping out the traditional intermediaries, the political bosses, as you said, the political parties, the labor unions, the groups that would sort of tell you how to vote and let you know what was in your interest. Now people are saying, even the journalists no longer have that role. Get out of the way, I'll make up my own mind because I can see what's going on for myself.
They're being raised on C-SPAN, where they just put up a camera and they show what's going on and people can make their own judgment. And that's sort of an interesting thing. You know, I don't want to keep going back on this historical treadmill, as it were, in a certain sense, but it's just so interesting that we had that participatory. And then there was a long eclipse, as it were, in a certain sense, with varying forms of authoritarian system, which has been the rule throughout human history. You did mention you mentioned Florence. You mentioned Venice. That they had attempts at this participatory democracy, but on the whole, it's been either authoritarian or, at best, after the French American Revolutions, this representative democracy which has been developed. You say it was done because of geographic, and the entity was large. Do you think there was any political trying to safeguard the interests of particular economic or just political interests that set up a government that was not direct in order to protect against the unwashed masses, as it were?
Well, there was a lot of that.
A political kind of oriented, thing. It wasn't just the geography didn't allow it or the distances didn't allow it.
No, the Constitution was written, as a matter of fact, replaced the Confederacy, that is the Articles of Confederation, because there was a great concern that poor people in the states were grabbing too much power. There were small rebellions going on, and there was great concern that the nation would not survive. And so the Constitution was set up with separation of powers and checks and balances, not only to protect the public against an overwhelming government, but also to protect the nation against an unruly majority. And one of the great dangers, and it's worked quite well, you know, during the years. We have a Bill of Rights, and minorities, even unpopular minorities, have a right to speak out. But one of the great dangers of having a direct democracy, a sort of a plebiscite government, is that the majority can just overrule the minority and banish them if they don't like what's happening.
There would be the need to have some sort of constitutional republic guarantees against that kind of thing in the name of civil liberties or something.
Well, when you have, that's right.
Safe that, yeah.
But it becomes much tougher. I mean, a court can overturn a law that Congress has passed or a state legislature has passed. But it's much more difficult for a court to overturn a referendum, a vote by the majority directly, that says, we don't care what the majority thinks because this is unconstitutional, it violates the rights of a minority, and we are going to go against the majority decision.
Right.
Nonetheless, I would suggest that the courts will have an expanded responsibility to preserve the rights of minorities under this growing direct democracy.
That you see is coming.
That is coming.
And the direct democracy is coming right out of the technological success or the technological
changes.
People we might try a constitution, or whether it's from spiritual sources or from, political dialogue or from political understanding. We try and get at some idea of human nature. We try and get at some abiding principles by which we can try and organize ourselves. I think maybe the world is reaching for that kind of thing now, some sort of a vision by which we can organize ourselves according to new realities that are emerging. We've tried to do that, but human nature probably, I don't know if the mitochondrial DNA is correct, we may all come out of Africa 200,000 years ago, the species or something, and we've been moving, or we have these wonderful cave paintings in France that just a whole new treasure trove has been made available to us from 30,000 years ago. But over the course of that long history of the species, we probably biologically have not altered that much. We're probably pretty much as Cro-Magnon man was, and so. But what has changed is this absolutely unbelievable, exponential, almost L-shaped development of technological development in your and my lifetime.
Yes.
And I wonder if we really, they come so fast now, whether we adequately appreciate those in a systemed way of what these things have and what these new developments are boding or not, or do we just allow it to take a form of free-floating angst that so many people in the society feel now, and without identifying exactly why it is and having policy that can relate to it? Right?
Well, I think we're much better at looking backward than we are looking ahead.
Looking in the rearview mirror, driving into the future.
Right. And we've heard an awful lot about the telecommunications revolution and the information superhighway and the vast changes that are going on in our shopping ability and in our entertainment and so on, and you can bank through your television set and your computer. But we've spent far too little time, it seems to me, and far too little effort worrying and wondering what all this is going to do and is doing to our political system, to our governance, to the nature of our democracy.
Right.
And that is going through huge changes. Like the ancient Greeks, when the United States started, there were only 10% of the public that was eligible to vote. Only white males of a certain age.
Women didn't get to vote.
Women didn't get to vote. African Americans didn't get to vote. Asians didn't get to vote.
Right.
Certainly Indians were not allowed to vote.
I know.
And now the vote is extended downward to 18-year-olds. It's extended to we have universal suffrage, so that there's been this growth of democratization. And now that combined with the interactive telecommunications, with the electronic revolution, where people can express themselves instantly to the remote government in Washington.
Yes.
That's had a profound change, and it's accelerating, as you point out.
Yeah, well, and it's happening. It's all happening in our lifetime. I can remember my mother won a race. She ran one of these things at a county fair, and she had the egg on the spoon, and she ran faster than anyone else without breaking the egg. And the prize was she got to get a ride in one of these new automobiles, And I mean, that was just within the lifetime of my mother. And these things are developing, and they're developing so quickly. You said that it affects the political institutions, the political dialogue, or the political dynamic. But it also affects consciousness itself. These various forms of communication. It was Marshall McLuhan, who you do cite in your book, who said that the medium is the message. The effects of the communication techniques that people interrelate to has more effect than what the message is in terms of just using the new technologies themselves affect consciousness. And we would do well to perhaps be able to understand that if we want to try and understand sociologically and politically what's going on.
Well, as McLuhan also said, you know, as the speed of communication accelerates, then the intermediaries, the representatives, will fade out, and the people will make a more directly make the decisions that affect their lives and their property.
Yeah. This
has great promise, because it's much better to have more control over your own life and be able to have a greater say in it over what will happen. But as we said, it also has great dangers. Unless we have the institutions and the education and the background to handle it with some rationality and some sense.
This moving toward increased participation, there are going to be some who simply don't want to participate. They don't care. I mean, they're living their own lives. They don't have a sense of civic responsibility. And unfortunately, that seems to be eroding. There's more and more people who, in a sense, seem to be willing to opt out.
Well, but that's not such an irrational view, you know.
Okay.
We tend to think that they're somehow irresponsible, or that it's bad, or people are lazy.
Well, this Council of 500 probably would have taken exception to that attitude.
But the fact is that for most people, they make a conscious decision that voting is irrelevant to their lives, that it doesn't matter who gets elected, nothing is really fundamentally changing. There is a very strong feeling in the country that the government and political decisions are controlled by special interests that have an awful lot of money to throw around, and that the people themselves are excluded from the decision making. And all I say, and they say that with a good deal of justice.
That's what I was going to say. We could tick those things off. Yeah.
And the only thing that I would say in response to that is, while that is all true to a large extent, we are coming to a point where the people can have a greater say, a greater role, because they become the fourth branch of government, as I suggest. Now, you also run great dangers in that those who have the money to reach the people have the capacity to persuade them, to manipulate the information so that only one side gets a reasonable hearing.
Back again to the Council of 500.
And so that's why you need a fair-minded system of information. You need a public telecommunications system that can balance off any one-sided efforts. You need to restrict the flow of money in politics, because those who, when you have a referendum, people spend tens of millions of dollars, corporations and others with special interests, to defeat a populist referendum or to pass something.
Yeah.
And all the statistics show he who spends more money ends up wielding more power.
Yeah, right. It is that way. You speak a good deal in the book about the political institutions need to vouchsafe and be concerned with political institutions. I wonder, is it possible for us to differentiate between, let's say, a political democracy, or a political representative democracy, let's say, as we traditionally have, where each citizen, and now we get it down to 18-year-olds and women and everybody, they can vote in an election or a plebiscite or something. It's a political democracy, but at the same time, there's a question of, can you differentiate between the political structure of the society and the economic structure of the society? And is it possible to have a political democracy, everybody gets a vote, but an economic plutocracy where the wealth and the economics is so skewed in favor of certain people, certain groups, that it underpins or just won't work? You need a certain kind of economic democracy in order to make political democracy work, or can you separate those two things out, or what do you think?
Well, that's the eternal enigma and dilemma, isn't it? We have, many would argue, a plutocracy here, or both in terms of control of the media. Very fewer and fewer companies are controlling more and more of the increasing numbers of channels.
It is, yeah.
And you have a growing disparity in income, where the country is becoming top-heavy.
Yes,
the rich
rather rapidly
own an awful lot of the country, and the middle class and the poor are increasing in number and decreasing in wealth.
And creating and increasing in a sense of angst,
which is partly causing the frustration.
And that does find political expression. But,
and then it ends up finding political expression. And if people feel that they are disenfranchised, that they have no role or no influence, That's what creates revolutions and upheavals. But we are reaching a point where they have a central role and are playing a central role. Nothing gets done in Washington without first testing the air and take the temperature of the public, taking public opinion polls.
Increasingly, isn't
absolutely.
it? Yeah, right.
And so it becomes critical that A, the public's opinion gets measured accurately and fairly, B, that there is some level playing field so that money doesn't influence all decisions and the outcome of all decisions, and C, that the people have some knowledge and concern about the issues so that they can vote intelligently when the polls are being taken.
Those are all big issues. Those are all very, very big issues, right.
And then, and if the media are the central channel that is bringing the information back and forth, both from the governed to the governors and from the governors to the governed, then you want to make darn sure that the media themselves are doing a responsible job, are letting all viewpoints be heard, giving access to everybody. And if it's electronics, that's going to be the ballot in the future, keypads and telecomputers. Then you've got to make sure, the way we make sure with universal telephone service and we made sure with rural electrification, that even the poor have access to these sophisticated mechanisms by which their voice can be heard in the seat of government.
Yeah, I made an allusion before to our public library system. Some people want to close it down because they're into disavowing public anything in the society, and I wonder about that. Those who would say the marketplace, the laissez-faire, the marketplace, Ricardo or whatever, they would just say that it just let the marketplace handle itself, iron wall, wages, and all the rest of it, and that everything will take care of itself in terms of the marketplace, and these things should be all handed over to the market without there being a public. What would you say to them? What do you say to them?
Well, I'm all in favor of deregulating content. I think the government should get out of it. But there are certain things in the marketplace, at least in the media, in communications, in the press, there are certain things that the marketplace cannot take care of that society needs desperately. Education, quality children's programming, free political time. I mean, by definition, none of those is a profit center that can be supported by advertising.
Edison schools and so forth, notwithstanding, and Mr. The people that are getting involved, Mr. What's his name, Whittle and so forth. The education is invariably a public factor.
Well, we want everybody to be educated.
Right.
It is critical that everybody gets a decent education and a civic education as well.
Right.
And while you can have a system of private schools, by definition, private schools are only going to be good for those who can pay.
Right. Okay.
And the increasing numbers of poor will be disenfranchised and diseducated or uneducated, and that would be a horrendous tragedy. I mean, that goes against the grain of our society and our democracy.
There's this tremendous force with the 104th Congress and Mr. Gingrich, and also so forth in the society, where they just seem to put up as a bogeyman any government at all, any federal government or any government at all seems to be the enemy of the people, and they've got this dialectic thing going where some of those people would just do away with any kind of government restraints whatsoever, and they say bring it back to the people, and to them we really have to have a more cautious, a more thoughtful kind of dialogue with that kind of thing, because that's going to run into inequities that won't probably they wouldn't even politically or wash. I mean, it would lead to a. But anyway,
there are a couple of elements of that are curious.
Yeah.
Yes, government doesn't work, they say, and therefore we've got to eliminate government.
Yeah.
But when it comes to defense, a very legitimate role of government, everybody relies on government, and some want to give more even than the government currently feels it needs for defense. When the issue of now that's very popular of getting things back to the states, devolving things away from Washington, not a bad idea, by the way, to get it closer to where people can have greater control over what happens. The great irony is, in our current system of communications with television, we know more about what's happening in Washington than we know the most mysterious places politically are our state capitals, which are removed, and City Hall, because there's no C-SPAN, for local government. There's no real coverage of the politics of local government, so that we've stood our federal government on its head. We know more about what's happening in the federal government, and we have more information about Congress and the President than we do about local government.
Now, why is that? People tend to be, people very often tend to be parochially interested in that which apparently affects their lives. Do we get to the point where we thought federal decisions affect our lives more than at the local city hall level, or has it devolved away from that kind of thing as far as people perceiving their own immediate interests, or what? Or is it just the way the news reporting developed? I mean, we began to develop... You've got a wide experience, having been at NBC and public television.
It's the economics of the media.
Okay.
After all, when you have television, you're looking for large audiences.
Right, that's true.
And the fact is that you get large audiences by things of nationwide interest.
Trying to find things that touch everybody.
And when you have a television station, a television signal, it does not reflect the political boundary lines. In other words, in New York, for example, the television station served New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and to some extent even Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So that it's very hard to have focus on local elections, to give local candidates an opportunity to get on television, because the people in New York City couldn't care less about what was going on in the state of Connecticut. The people in New Jersey have no interest in the who wins the governorship or the mayoralty in New York.
Yeah.
So that you don't have a communication center that is locally based, but everybody has a certain interest, at least in Washington. And as long as you had a global conflict and world war and a communist threat, then it became something of national interest. So we have a communication system that is stronger in dealing with national efforts than with dealing in local efforts.
And the local news seems to have taken on a formula to where it's all crime and it's very sensationalized and so on. Do you understand the dynamics of how you had a thing where you were testing one of the local television stations here at one time, but what is the dynamic of that? Is that economics or what?
Well, again,
it's just like violence after violence after violence, and there's very little news that is got the dimension or the depth or the gravitas that the national news, such as it does have, is presented, it seems. And it seems to be a formula that works.
Well, it's a formula that works because it attracts audience. It's tabloid news, it's sensationalism. People are legitimately worried about crime in the streets. And somebody wrote a very bright essay called that talks about television as a medium without a place. There's no sense of place. The news about crime can be transferred any place in the country, and it really doesn't matter, and you really have no sense of where you are. But everybody's worried about it, and so what you get is the headlines and the immediate sort of kind of instant emotional response news, outcome of sports events, baseball scores, football scores, tragedies, accidents, crime, weather, and very little of the sort of long-term stuff that we have to pay a lot of attention to and know about if we're going to be intelligent citizens.
These are market-driven. These are things that are market. They're going to get their advertising, they're going to get their local thing, they're going to get viewership. It's like tabloid journalism, and so with Fleet Street or something like that. But does that say, in your view, then, that to the degree that exists in national or in local and in regional and in national patterns, to the degree that does exist, does that say to you that we are going to have an important role for public television?
Yes,
you were president of PBS.
I think there's got to be public. I think public broadcasting, and now we talk telecommunications. It's not just radio and television, but it's cable and it's interactive telecommunications. It's working through your computer, so you can get the community bulletin boards and so on. There has to be a public component to that, and that becomes more important than ever, it seems to me, because of the critical nature of our civic discourse. And I think that should be paid for by the commercial guys who are being deregulated. They no longer have a public service obligation, which they've always had. And in return for deregulation and letting them do what they want with their channels and with their signals, and they're operating on public airwaves, or monopoly franchises that were given by municipalities for cable, they ought to pay a fee for that. And that fee ought to not only reduce the deficit, but it ought to go to help pay for the things that society needs: education, children's programming, civic programming, free political time, access to town meetings and discussions on major issues.
And how will they determine that? Would that be politically determined? That would be determined by civic leaders?
I think
Mr. Gingrich would have had us, get good underwriting and profit making for big bird and so forth. I mean, they're trying to put everything into the marketplace.
Well,
determined by civic leaders and
I have no problem with part of public television being supported by advertising as long as it's. I mean, there are certain kinds of programs, drama. A contemporary version of the great old magazine series, for example, Omnibus or The Great American Dream Machine.
Yes.
You could get advertisers to pay for that, but there are certain things that advertising should not be advertiser-driven. Children's programming, educational programming, civic programming. And for those you need a source, I think a public trust fund that comes out of some of the revenues from the commercial side, by auctioning off the spectrum, auctioning off frequencies. These are public resources that private companies are exploiting, as they should, making a tremendous amount of money out.
Yeah, right. And they should,
and paying nothing for it.
And they should do that to the greater than we have. Do you think the public, like public television, here we have NET, WNET, and so forth, that the public television system, which has also been under attack by some of in the 104th Congress, and so forth, as you're aware, that should be vouchsafed, the public television system that we have? Or what is your view of that, having been president of it?
Well, I think it should, and I think we have to take a hard look at how to revitalize and reevaluate. I mean, public television should serve as democracy's forum.
Okay.
Right. And the outlet for all of this kind of stuff that we're talking about. And so it needs the resources, the money to do that. Even Chairman Pressler of South Dakota, who has been a very vigorous opponent and an attacker of public broadcasting, has talked recently now about setting up a trust fund out of the income from spectrum auctions to pay for educational and public and civic television. And I think this is a very healthy move.
Television, you've been primarily involved with television yourself in your own history. You were at PBS, and you were president of NBC.
NBC News.
NBC News, and then you were also involved with were you involved with local television?
I was involved with local television in the beginning, and I organized a group back in 1969.
Right, you did a challenge at one of the local
challenge, WPIX in New York, Channel 11, which it was in the aftermath of that frightful set of riots, the race riots in the 1968-69 period after the assassination of Martin Luther King. And the quality of local coverage, local news, was just appalling. There was none in those days. I mean, it was virtually all national news. And we put together a citizens group of experienced television people, as well as Wall Street investors, as well as minority owners. It was an integrated group, the first in the history of broadcasting, to apply for the license to show how a responsible, independent commercial broadcaster could operate. And we uncovered all kinds of scandals involving that station. And the hearing went on it was a public trial. It went on for 6 years.
No kidding. That long? I didn't realize that from the book.
And then I left to become president of PBS. And eventually they settled, and they changed the management, and the station became a lot better.
And I thought I read in there that they thought that you were going to present news in such a way that they said it would be impossible to do, because it was too costly to do that. But you were fully able to do that. You'd researched
the first issue against us in the trial, in this comparative hearing between the two, was a financial issue, because we had said we would do an hour local news a night.
Yeah, right.
And they said that was impossible.
Right? Now it's done routinely, right?
We just did it to hype the application.
Right. But you've been involved with television, but you've always had, as you are in the media, people in the media have always had your eye on this larger dimension of telephony and the internet and the computers and the marriage of the computer and so forth. Is that, the CIA missed the breakdown of the Soviet Union. I mean, it was a big story of our era and so on. But were you able, being in television, be able to see that there was going to be this marriage of the computer and the telecommunications so well? I mean, or has that come sort of unexpected by a lot of people who are involved in telecommunications?
Well, I think it comes unexpected. You tend to try to keep repeating what you've always done.
Right. We're all subject to that.
I mean, the interesting, when you going to this question and the question you asked before about the marketplace should decide everything. The two most interesting developments of current times, three actually, are one, the satellite.
Yeah.
Satellite was a public investment, not a
Thank you, Mr.
marketplace
Clark.
investment.
Yes.
The first broadcaster to put a satellite, to be distributed by satellite, was PBS. We introduced it.
Really?
All my
I didn't
colleagues
realize,
in the commercial networks thought that was a terrible idea
Never worked.
until we did it, because it was a lot cheaper way to distribute and it gives much more local control. And then the networks came aboard afterwards. The internet.
What year was that? Do you
Yes,
remember?
yes, it began in 1976 when I came to PBS.
Okay, right.
The internet, the biggest thing in the new modern
that sort of
telecommunications
just crept
world.
up all of a sudden. There it is.
No investor would have invested in a thing called the internet or
Right.
like the internet. It was started at the Department of Defense. It was
ARPANET.
paid for by the National Science Foundation.
Right.
It is public telecommunications, and now everybody's climbing on board it to capitalize on it and make money off of it.
Yeah.
And of course, the computer itself, the invention of the computer chip, was an invention spawned and paid for by the government, again for defense purposes. So that the combination of efforts of the private sector and the public sector, and the strength of both, becomes very important in carrying forward our society. And it's a terrible mistake, I think, to say everything should be left to the private marketplace. Because if that's the case, none of these sort of breakthroughs would have happened. Or would
They'd
have
all
taken
come from government-backed support and research and that kind of thing. And we don't usually get we don't get much economic fallout. A lot of that is just taken over by private companies who benefit greatly by that for the relatively few who own their stock and that sort of thing, which is not very, very widespread. But we had this tradition of, we used to talk about telecommunications and computing. Now we're beginning to get, and you say yourself, the television, where we talk about 500 channels, it is likely to be not so much 500 channels as just a television set that'll give you
like a video dial.
Or something. Yeah, like a video dial tone or something like that. But there's or telecomputing. They'll talk about, George Gilder will talk about telecomputing is going to surpass television and that sort of thing. So these combination of these different kind of media are blending into one, do you think, or is it still all right to talk in your mind, or is it appropriate to talk in terms of the distinction between computer and telecommunications? And we had the Office of Telecommunications and computer and that, but I mean, are they now becoming to where these all are just one large system that we have to understand and can understand them as a system in a way that we haven't traditionally been able to, being isolated in our various ways of thinking about communication?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. For example, we think of print as something different from television.
Well, okay,
but now a lot of the stuff that you see on your television screen is print from your computer or from transmissions.
Yeah, increasingly.
As we move into the digital age, where everything is transformed is transported, if you will, in terms of pluses and minuses, or zeros and ones. And then it can be turned into print on a page, or it can be turned into a television screen presentation, or it can be turned into a video cassette. The New York Times and the USA Today are print publications transmitted by satellite through electronics to printing plants all over the country and the world. So yes, there's an integration, there's a convergence of print and electronics and audio and video. And at the same time, there's still different media, but it's very hard to have different public policies now. I mean, we've always had broadcasting set of public policies where broadcasters were regulated and they had certain content responsibilities to serve the community interest. They had to be fair, they had to offer equal time. Whereas newspapers and magazines could be as unfair as they want, had no responsibilities.
Why was that, do you think? It was because they felt that they were less immediately effective, or what was the reason for that distinction?
Well, I think there were several.
Or what is it?
Several. One is that the government had to be involved in broadcasting because they had to allocate the frequencies, what radio stations could go in what direction.
You can't have cross-static.
And then in deciding which people to give the frequencies to, which applicants, they had to make a decision as to which one would better serve the public interest. So that immediately set up some standards of public interest service. The other was that people were afraid of the power of communications, of electronic communications. You saw what happened with Adolf Hitler. You saw what happened with Stalin. And every government except ours started with its public radio and public television first, and commercial came later, because governments wanted to hold on to control as they did when print was invented.
Mm-hmm. We talk about this democracy, and after we got to get back, you're talking about an economic, the electronic republic and the democracy and moving toward participatory democracy. Do you think, I mean, this is in a sense a good thing that people are being empowered if they will take that power, if they will take the civic responsibility seriously, and that is an educational thing and something that we'd want to encourage. But do you think there's a danger in the fact that the power of the media is becoming in fewer and fewer corporate hands, and there's a consolidation all the time as to fewer and fewer? We mentioned off camera, Ted Turner said it's going to get down to a handful of companies going to control 85% of what we see, hear, read, and think about. And is that a problem, do you think?
Oh, I think
are there enough players, or what do you think?
No, I think it's an enormous problem. We're seeing it now with the merger of Ted Turner and Time Warner. We're seeing it with Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, a worldwide global enterprise. We're seeing it with General Electric, which was originally forced to divest itself of NBC in the early days of RCA, now coming and owning not only NBC, but cable channels and having financial interests. I'll tell you where a specific problem, for example.
Okay.
In cable, which has all of these channels, CNN, which is a wonderful service as a news service, but it's the only cable news service there is. Now, there are many others who wanted to start a competing cable news service, or several.
There's some talking channels that are beginning.
Well, but they're not news reporting.
Not hard news, right?
But what happened was that Ted Turner sold a large chunk of CNN, a large chunk of his enterprise, to major cable operators, TCI, Time Warner, Cox, and since they are investors in CNN,
they had to do that to get all those movies.
Since they're investors in CNN, in effect, they're not, and they're the gatekeepers of their cable franchises. They won't allow another competing general news channel on because it'll only diminish the value of CNN.
So how do we get around
So it's not the public that's making a decision as to whose news is best. It's the ownership, and that requires some public policy. You know, it's like the days you're interested in history. 100 years ago, when the railroads, then in the Industrial Revolution, controlled the infrastructure of our society because they controlled the transportation. They had the land from the great land grants. And they used their power of transportation to end up controlling the steel mills and the coal mines and the lumber harvesting until antitrust came along and broke them up.
Roosevelt,
And now we have the information age coming along, the information revolution replacing the industrial revolution, and you get those who control the distribution, again, taking control of the content that they carry, the programs, the program services, the cable networks, and I think that's very dangerous. And I think that that we have got to start looking very hard at the policy that we've always had of diversifying ownership. You know, if one owner owns the one newspaper in town and the major television stations and major radio stations and the major magazines, that's giving an awful lot of power to one voice.
Sure is.
Even if you have many outlets. And so I think we have to have a strong public policy of diversification of ownership.
And how do we do that? Do we allow? We can do it in the name of antitrust. We can try and do it so that we can allow many voices to compete, make the ground rules right for competing, or do we do it by decree, or how is it?
You do it several ways.
Letting the market do it, or and you don't want to have a situation where freedom of the press is great for he who owns the press.
That's right.
Right. That's that problem. Or the broadcasters.
But as you say, you can have antitrust looking into whether there's too much concentration of ownership. Another is public policy. You know, when you have one monopoly, like the telephone company, that controls telephone, then they have to act as what we call common carriers. Namely, they have to let everybody in, and they can't decide who has the right to use a telephone and who does not.
So Mr. McGowan came along, and Mr. Judge Green and so forth. They did have some...
But they still have to let the first come, first serve. You can pick up and talk to anybody you want, and anybody can pick up a phone and use it.
In a common carrier.
And now we have that coming to television, I think.
You think so?
As you have many.
Do you think that's appropriate that we get to see them as common carriers?
You can pass a rule, make a rule that says that the owner of a cable franchise, who the gatekeeper, who controls who goes in and who goes out of all of those hundreds of channels that are coming, should not be allowed to own more than a small number of the channels himself.
And this could be publicly discussed.
And it should be
on the internet and other places where people could participate in the decision-making on this, rather than be just a matter of the public, of the special interests who are involved in that.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you have spectrum that's available, it should be auctioned off to the highest bidder. And the money, some of the money should go to a protected, to pay for a protected area where the public will have access, and political parties and interest groups and labor unions and so on will be able to have access and have the funds to pay for the production of programs and information to go out to the people.
I wonder if I can ask you something. You've been involved in broadcast in television for a very long time. You've been able to see, and we've been able to see ourselves, just as we look, that prototypes always of a new system are always highly expensive. I mean, the first time that one tries something, it's very expensive, but then prices can erode. The microchip is one process of, obviously that it could be. Do you think, what is the general trending in terms of, let's say, reaching television screens, let's just say that, with information? Is the tendency through time, is the price able in a market venue or market situation where you got competitive force and so forth, are the prices able to stabilize? Are they able to erode through time? Can we see with the new technologies that are coming a possibility of there being erosion so that the money factor in terms of television might become less or not? Particularly as you get more and more channel capacity, you get more and more people who are interested in doing it. And what would the marketplace forces be? Or do you see that there will be, because the cost of using television is so high now, politically and other, for political campaigns and so forth. But I wonder, what do you think is the longer term, what has been the tendency and what is the longer term trend of costs of telecommunications?
Well, I think it's
for citizens or for institutions?
It's a mixed bag. In other words, the distribution costs are coming down.
Okay.
It used to be that when you made it, I mean, let's take telephone, which everybody's familiar with and knows about costs.
Right.
You made long-distance costs were huge.
Yes.
Overseas costs were just something you never did.
One call a year or something, right?
Now with the satellite, distance doesn't matter. It costs as much, or it should cost as much, to call across the street, because the signal is bouncing up to the satellite and going back down again, as it costs to call across the country, and soon as it costs to call from here to China. It's the same signal, going to the same satellite. Doesn't matter how far it travels, it's instantaneous. And the costs are coming way down on distribution.
All right.
And with many more channels, that is true.
And with television, the same?
And with television, the same. What the costs that are not coming down are the costs of production. If you want to make a movie, you want to make a television show with production values, those costs keep going up. You're paying for stars, you're paying for production values. Now you can have programs that are very cheap.
Yes, right.
Like this one, which has two people sitting here talking, and you don't need 98 cameras, and you don't need a lot of fancy lighting. And so you're seeing a lot more of it because you got to have radio has become a talk medium. Talk and music. Why? Because talk is cheap, and music is free. They get the music because it serves to promote the sales of CDs and records.
But it's on the production end that the costs are rising, as far as you can see. Then it's not on the distribution end. Well, is that distribution end going to catch up with us so that it'll make available more and more possibilities for alternative voices to be able to be heard?
This program is a good example of that. But every cable system of a certain size has to reserve a certain number of channels for what the PEG channels they call, for public use, for educational use, and for government use.
Okay.
And they do reserve those channels, but none of those channels, well, 15% of them only, is activated.
Now, why is that?
Because there's no money.
The citizens just haven't risen to the possibility.
There's no money available to produce the content of those channels. That's why you need a telecommunications fund. The cable operators pay 5% of their revenue to the municipalities that franchise them, but that money goes right into the central treasury. It doesn't go to pay for
studios
operating these channels.
Do you think it's important that there be that? I mean, is there to a degree that citizens haven't risen, again, an erosion of a sense of civic pride or responsibility, which is a real problem in our country, a sense of the civic space is being lost. People haven't risen to that, or they haven't insisted on it, or they haven't seen that this is a possibility, that they should have access to these things, and maybe it's a consciousness problem in terms of the broad
Sure, that's part of it.
And that would be part of the decision-making of your electronic republic that you're talking about.
To open it up. But increasingly, as with the telephone,
Right.
you know, and as with electricity, which used to be confined only to the rich, this is going to become a standard, universal, available effort. You'll be able to talk one-on-one. You'll be able to talk to groups that you organize, as you can already through the internet. And you'll be able to do it with pictures as well as with print.
And have profound implications in terms of the political organization of our society.
And that will change, and has already changed the political
Bruce
organization.
Springsteen has a song that everyone's familiar with, I guess. It's called 57 Channels and Nothing On. He said he got, that there's, or you go through, there's a great deal of it is market-oriented kind of things, which is almost like, in a sense, tabloid. Every once in a while you get to PBS and you get some quality thing, or you get, as you mentioned, Brian Lamb's C-SPAN, where they have some real in-depth programming. What is your general thought about the possibility that we will be able to get, this is a quality, value-laden question, but that we're going to be able to get more quality programming in that? I know you're involved, if you don't mind, with a new venture you're thinking of trying to do something?
Yes, we're working on a new cable. It would be public broadcasting's access to cable, opening to cable. And it will be, it's called Horizons, and the idea is to do a cultural counterpart to C-SPAN. That is to bring into the home the great events that go on in the university campuses, in libraries, in museums, you know, the auditoriums, the lectures, the readings, the discussions, the recitals, and everything from science to art to music to history to literature, which people have been excluded from unless they live next to such an institution and can pay the tickets, you know, in the auditoriums. Yeah, well, these are always sold out events.
Now there should be, we've got enough police shows and enough violence and enough things in there, but we could have a higher quality of programming. And do you think this is something that's going to be able to work without there being
this could work.
Arm twisting, a political arm twisting, it can work in the market? And whether the sense of civic responsibility and involvement of the citizenry might make for a bigger audience as they develop that.
Well, I think this could work. We've tested it, and it will be a good business. But a lot of other things are going to take subsidy in order to work, or paying for, that we think are important. You know, as we pay for education, as we pay for defense, and children's programming, quality children's programming is a good example of that.
Yeah, right.
But you know, it's not going to happen automatically. That's the whole point.
Right, exactly.
Just because there are more channels.
Right. And it's going to take some decision making by people who have a sense of civic responsibility for these things, and it's going to take some concern about, we're coming into a new era, the electronic, and I want to show the book again at the outset. It's by Viking, incidentally, and it is the Electronic Republic, right? And it's extremely interesting and important book, in my view, and I'd like to recommend it very highly to anyone. They ought to get it. It's the Electronic Republic, Reshaping Democracy in the Information Age, and it's the work of Lawrence Grossman, who's been our guest. And Lawrence, or Larry, thank you very, very much.
Okay, Harold.
It's been a great pleasure, and I thank you for not only for coming in for this and for participating, but for all your work over a long and distinguished career. I really do thank you for that very, very much.
Thank you very much.
We in Conversation invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for this particular segment. We'll see you next week, and once again, Larry Grossman, thank you very much indeed. Until next time. I've gone through and underlined the whole book. I mean, I said to a friend of mine, it doesn't do any good when you go to underline certain sections and then underline practically the whole book. It takes away from the quality. But I think you've done a really very, very good job. I congratulate you.
Great.
Yeah, it's well written, and it's something that's very needed.
Good.
And I wish you well on your new venture. You know,
Thank you.
When do you think you might be able to get going?
Oh, it'll be a year. I mean, we just got to get more capacity in the cable business.
I had mentioned to you this American, what is it, talking?
American
News Channel. No, it's called News Channel. News
Talk.
News Talk. No, that's one that Robert Ailes is involved. This is called Fitzpatrick, and they've got it's called News Talk Television. And they really do quite well, I think. You know, they have a person on the set that's tied into the internet, and if they're going to get a question of how many people voted in that election, they could try and call it up right away, and they're trying to make it a node of information. boy, Lord, no. I did a lot of programs with Russell Long. Remember when he was finance chairman? And he became a Kelsonian. And much to the chagrin of many established economists, because he's got a view of economics that, but I can't help thinking it might make sense in terms of what people in policy positions are going to need to have some sort of understanding of economic changes in the society. But we'll see on that. But I think so, and I'm encouraged by the fact that the Club of Rome is going to do this special study on it. It'll be in October. But it's not a popular thing. Most people want to make either, some system of either supply side or tax and spend, or just traditional economic policy. This would call for something that would be a little bit different. Or it's called binary economics, which kind of fits into the binary age. And I'm sort of on the tack that I think maybe this will be a system where you can, sort of like Keynes or something. Right. But are we wrapped then? Yes. Oh, okay, fine.
Okay, we can